The boy asked, plain and small, like a question from a porch swing. "Are you leaving?" She went still like someone hit the brakes inside her skin. Her hand, the one clasping that crumpled envelope, stopped mid-reach. Her breath caught. For a second the world narrowed down to the gate bell, the way the light fell through the cottonwoods, and the way Rex sat at my feet, eyes on her like he'd been waiting his whole life to know if trouble would cross this yard. I remember exactly where I was when she froze. The porch step under my knees, the screen door half open, sweat on my forearms from fixing the fence earlier that afternoon. It's a strange thing to watch a person shrink without a sound. You can feel the whole history of them in the pause, the apologies they're saving, the shame that's been practiced until it becomes muscle memory. I thought then that if a question could make someone small enough to disappear, I would stand in front of it. If this story finds you and you like the kind of slow-burn things that live and breathe on small details, dust in sunbeams, a dog that names you by presence, a life remade, stick around. There are worse ways to spend an afternoon than listening to how two stubborn, guilty people try, clumsily, to keep another human being from being written off. Her name was Emily Carter. She showed up in the kind of dusk that softens edges, late enough that the heat has given up but early enough for the light to lie. She was in a dress too thin for the wind that lives on this part of the county, and her hair had been braided like she was still holding on to something that hadn't been promised to her. The envelope in her hand was the sort of thing that carries its own story. Edges worn, paper limp, a notary stamp that had been pressed with the impatience of someone who wanted irrevocable things to look final. People come to my gate for two reasons: a truck that needs fixing or bad news that doesn't know where else to go. Mostly it's farmers bringing up the weather, a neighbor wanting to borrow a tool, or kids looking for a place to roll their trucks down the hill. This was neither. She stood on my gravel like she'd failed to stay small enough to be ignored. Rex the collie loped out, made himself a posture of equal parts guard and welcome, and kept watch with his head cocked. For a moment his barking made the question in the boy's voice sound like a dangerous thing. The boy was the neighbor's, Danny Hale, 10 years old, hair forever in his face, who'd learned to ride the fence posts and tell the truth as if he owed it rent. He'd followed me out to the porch with a baseball glove and a curiosity that has now and then saved me trouble by its plainness. He asked the question that seemed ordinary until you weighed the weight behind it. "Are you leaving?" Emily's face didn't show anything like the weather. It showed consequences. Her fingers tightened on the envelope until the paper creased. For the first time that evening, I noticed the smell, cheap perfume wrapped in cigarette smoke, the sharp tang of someone who'd spent money she didn't have on pretending everything was as it once was. She looked at me, and it felt like she was asking permission from the ranch itself. I could have sent her away. That would have been easier. But my father used to say people aren't fences to tack a notice on. There are things I learned from him that come out without my asking. Open the door, offer coffee, keep your hands visible. I stepped down off the porch and opened the gate. The metal squealed and the sound folded into the evening like a good, honest beginning. "Sit," I told her, because sometimes the simplest command is the only steering a frayed person can trust. I fetched a glass from the kitchen, the one with a tiny chip on the rim, the same one I always drink out of when my hands are tired. She accepted the water like it might be a wage, like her own thirst was a debt to the world. We sat on the porch steps. Rex leaned his head against her knee as if he knew she needed to be reminded she wasn't invisible. She told me, halting, that her father had taken out a loan years back. Something about the house, something older than her memory. She used the word payment like it was a natural noun. She was to be the payment. She said it like the sentence had lived in her for so long she had stopped questioning its grammar. It was the sort of thing you hear and don't quite process, because your mind stops at words like payment when a human face is involved. It was only later, in the kitchen light as I thumbed through the envelope, that the bones of it came into focus. Inside was notarized paperwork, names, dates, a filing stamp for the county clerk's office, the kind of formality people lean on when they want what they're doing to look legitimate. There was an old, chewed photograph of a farmhouse, which I recognized by its crooked porch as one that had been in the Carter family a long time. There were signatures that might have been made by a hand trembling from guilt or habit, and there was a headline, typed and clear, Agreement of Collateral, Personal Compensation. I read it once, twice, then a third time because the words kept rearranging in my head like fields under different seasons. The paper said that Jim Carter, Emily's father, who I've seen stand in the bar doorway more nights than I can count, had agreed to put his daughter's services as collateral against a debt, that a man could pledge someone else as if they were livestock. The absurdity of it burned. I felt my throat tighten the way it always does when things are unfair, and I can't do numbers around them. Anger is a warm animal that wakes inside me at odd hours. I try to keep it on a leash. I told her I'd sleep on the couch, that she didn't have to leave that night. She didn't say thank you. She looked too tired and too ashamed for the word. Instead, she folded her hands over the envelope and pressed them to her chest, like she was holding a wound closed. That night I didn't sleep much. I paced the barn, listened to Rex's breathing, to the cricket scritch on the porch screen. The county clerk's office opens early, and I plan to be there first. There are times in a life when the practical voice, that small, steady way of counting what paperwork says, has to be louder than the part of you that wants to soothe. This was one of those times. By morning light I drove into town with the envelope on the passenger seat, the smell of old smoke in the car mingling with the dusty leather. The clerk was a woman named Lulu, who knows everybody's genealogy and keeps the key to every oddity filed in that county. She squinted at the notary stamp, tapped a key, and pulled up a page under the old ledger. "There's nothing here under Jim Carter for that year," she said, fingers poised like she refused to speak anything harsh without proof. "We don't have a filing like this in our registry." We went to the bank after that. People think banks are cold. They're not. They have their own small kindnesses, the kind that come from bored clerks and men who've been around bad loans long enough to know how they stack the cards. A young representative pulled up email records, something about a forgiveness notice sent years ago when flood insurance helped tide the Carter farm over. "It was resolved," he said. Voice flat like boredom could be a balm. "Loan was paid in full, forgiveness recorded. If the loan was forgiven, then why did Emily show up on my porch with papers saying she was payment? If the ledger said the debt didn't exist anymore, then who had filed this new thing in her name? The math didn't add up. There always seems to be a hole somewhere where logic should be." I left the bank with copies of their records printed, and a silence in the car that felt like an answering to something bad. Back on the ranch, I sat at the kitchen table and spread out the documents like a map. The envelope, the photograph, the bank printout, a county filing that my fingers found beneath the photograph that was filed only a few weeks before Emily arrived. A lien. Filed in the county land records under Emily Carter's name. Filed by a company, Salazar Recovery Services, that I didn't much like the look of. I looked up Salazar online, because when your hands are dirty and your heart is full of hurt, the internet is the easiest ledger to access. It didn't take long. There were glossy photos of men in suits, testimonials that read like old scripts, and a business model that smelled like predation dressed as customer service. They boasted about repossessing property, about securing collateral. They used words like recovery and asset protection, the way someone might use prayers to justify an ugly thing. I called Emily and told her what I'd found. She listened through the speaker and did not move. When she spoke, her voice was small. "My dad, he said it was the only way to keep the house," she told me. "He said if he signed it over like that, they'd let him keep the lot. He told me he'd bring me back." The sentence was a rope frayed by grief. She sounded like someone who had been rehearsing a betrayal to keep hunger from being hungrier. "Did he sign for you?" I asked. She didn't answer at first. Then, "I signed before I knew what it was. I thought, he told me it was a promise. He said he'd get help. He said he'd fix it. He's not the kind of man to... He can't keep his hands off the dice." She tried to laugh and it broke. "Maybe he signed it because he thought I would be safer in the city." There are people who make terrible choices because their own shame is louder than any caution. Jim Carter had been that kind of man, loving in the way an animal is loyal to its routine, and cruel in the way addiction rewires the heart. I used to see him hauling fence posts in the summers when he had a job, shirt sleeves rolled, a laugh that could fill this yard. I had also seen him on Friday nights with a red face and a slump at the shoulder that told you the next day there would be bills he couldn't meet. I called the county clerk back and asked for copies of the document the Salazar people had filed. The clerk emailed them to me. The signature looked like a frightened ghost, scribbled, flattened. It should have been easy to prove forgery, but fabricating what looks like a hurried signature is a craft that thrives under complacent clerks and quiet corners. Whoever had filed it had taken pains to make it look official. Salazar Recovery Services called 2 days later. Their man, Victor Salazar, called on a number that showed up as private. He spoke like someone who'd had practice in making others feel small without raising his voice. "We have a client who is being held to an agreement," he said. "Legal remedies can be simple. People who consent have obligations." I told him where we lived. He said he knew where the property was and that their representatives might stop by to confirm things. He was careful with his words, as if he were playing on a chessboard where clinks of silver were always a threat. I hung up and felt something low and old in my chest, like worry wrapped in the shape of duty. He arrived on a Thursday, 2 days after the call, with a car that smelled of cologne, and a manner that suggested he'd been raised on contracts and certainty. He had a man with him who kept his hands folded and moved when told. They walked the gravel to the porch and introduced themselves like guests in a garden party, except their smiles didn't reach their eyes. "You're the one named on those filings?" Victor asked, addressing me because it's expected someone will try to speak to the landowner. "No," I said. "She's staying here. I'll hear you out on the porch if you like." Victor smiled, the kind of smile that does arithmetic on your patience. "We're here to make a simple collection," he said. "We have a secured interest. We'd like to recover collateral." The word collateral says a lot when it's about a person. I watched Emily shift in the doorway behind me, hands tucked into the pocket of that thin dress, as if she were trying to shrink to the size of a coin. You can see it in people. When they've been told they have a price, they begin to look like they've been paid for. It's ugly and it's honest. "I don't think you know our law," I said slowly, because fast talk is their currency and slow talk is mine. "People aren't property in this state. If you have something filed that says otherwise, we'll see it in court." Victor tilted his head, and the light caught the edge of his jaw. "Court takes time," he said. "Sometimes voluntary arrangements are easier. There's nothing you can do to stop a repossession if the paperwork is in place. Why fight when there's an option that's cleaner?" I could smell fear on Emily then, like rain before wind. She stepped forward, which surprised me. Small acts of movement are often louder than grand proclamations, and said, "I'm not collateral." Victor looked at her like she'd used an odd metaphor. "Miss Carter, this is a civil matter. We're not here to demonize anyone. We simply need to enforce the agreement." I put a hand on the wooden rail of the porch until the grain bit into my palm, to remind myself that the world is, sometimes, stubbornly made of ordinary things. "Get off my property," I said to him, because sometimes the voice that's tired of being reasonable needs a rougher edge. "And if you file anything in my name without proof, you can expect the sheriff." He smiled thinner. "We prefer cordiality," he said, and the smile was a seal that said he's used to people folding at a certain roundness of coin. That afternoon I called Tom Harland. Tom Burns's route is the one I trust, and he was as blunt as a hammer on a barn door. "First step, file for a temporary restraining order and an emergency injunction," he said. "We block their action until they can prove the lien is valid." He went on to explain, in terms that would make a layman's head swim less than hearing a storm approaching, that a forged document can be undone by proper process, but the delays are where the damage lives. "Paperwork has teeth," he warned. "They'll try to snap them in ways that make a person think it's true." Then, under his advice, I went back to the county recorder with Tom on the line and asked for notarized copies of every filing under Emily's name. Among the clean prints and heavy stamps, I found an odd little addendum, a clause that referenced mineral rights on the Carter land, something that in this county you don't mention unless you want to change the value of people's lives. I felt an old, cold pit open in me. Someone had noticed the worth of that ground. Someone had decided it would be easier to take that worth if they could make a paperwork ghost to go with it. Emily sat across from me that night with a cup of coffee gone cold. She didn't sleep. She told me, finally, that her father had been juggling debts like hot coals. He'd taken some money from a man who needed quick profit, and who used a company to recover when the man skipped town. Jim thought the paperwork would be enough to buy time. He'd been too ashamed to tell the truth. He thought he could sign for his daughter and take it back later. He said he could fix it, she said, voice threaded with the old tenderness people have for those they still love despite their harm. He said he'd put it right, but he hasn't. Sometimes people break the world by trying to balance it on a sliver of confidence. I thought of the nights I've patched fence posts with wire and prayer, of the ways we all think a knot can hold if we believe hard enough. This wasn't a knot you could fix with wire. "Did he sign your name?" I asked. "No," she whispered. "I think he forged it. I thought he'd signed me up voluntarily at first because he told me he would bring me back. I thought it was a promise the way people promise in the darkness, like an arrangement to protect what he could. I didn't think he'd let them file anything." We slept badly. Morning came with a sense that the world had sharpened its edges. The sheriff's deputy, Mason, came by mid-morning after I called him. He's a man who walks like he's pulled by the gravity of the county, all slow and deliberate. He sat in my kitchen while I spread the filings across the table, and he stared at the signatures like someone looking for a trick. "There's enough here to get a judge to look," he said finally. "We can issue a complaint, make a record, but arrests, no. This is civil unless we can prove fraud." "Fraud's a real thing," I said, "but their men are already circling like vultures. If there's any way to stop them from showing up with a court order and making a scene, we'll take it." We filed the complaint that afternoon. Tom advised we petition for a temporary restraining order against Salazar Recovery Services to prevent them from taking any action on the lien until the court could hear the case. Filing form smells like ink, and the last patience of people who have to believe the law is a net that sometimes catches the small things and sometimes lets them fall through. Victor Salazar didn't wait for paper. He came back with a man who had a face like it had been carved from a ledger. They parked too close to the mailbox where the gravel throws itself in complaints. Emily stood in the doorway and the world shrank again to the measurement of a breath. He spoke in that same practiced, polished way. "We'd like to come onto your property to inspect," he said. "We'll be gentle. It's in everyone's best interest to be cooperative." "Not while I'm here," I said, and the words were simple, the kind I like to use when I mean them. "You'll wait until you have a court order." He smiled like a man who knows the value of a drawn line. "We'll have it sooner than you think," he said. "Sometimes threats are a courtesy. Judge's patience isn't endless." His men looked like men who had been told stories of property and receipts all their lives. They had the idle air of people who think paperwork is a kind of prayer. They left that day under the worst kind of promise, the sort that doesn't say what the future will look like, only that it will come. After they drove off, after the dust settled like a slow apology on the road, Emily sat in the yard and watched Rex chase a tumbleweed without seeing it. She counted nothing aloud. I sat beside her, because it seemed the only decent thing to do. We had both been living lives of quiet, and now our quiets had slammed together. It made a sound like a bell in a church with no congregation left. "You don't have to stay because of him," I said. "I know," she said, head tipped back to see the sky, like she was trying to measure how much of the world she had the right to. "I thought I had no right to stay anywhere that wasn't part of a bargain." "You don't owe the world your being," I said. There is no easy way to tell someone that. The truth can be a blunt tool. You can choose. It came out softer than I meant. Saying it felt like putting my own fingers to a wound and deciding to keep it from bleeding alone. She laughed once, a small sound that started as surprise and slid into something like hope. "I don't even know how to choose," she admitted. "My life's been full of other people choosing it for me." "You learn," I said. "Slow. On good days." It was the kind of answer you get in a town where people mend and set, and then go back to the field. It's not heroic. It's what you have. We had 3 days, Tom said. That's how long he thought we had before the court would look at our emergency motion, and before Salazar might try to force a showing. 3 days, he said, like a man counting sugar, which is how I remember him, practical and lean. Enough time to get the injunction in place if the judge is sensible. 3 days to prove the obvious. 3 days to show a forgery. 3 days for people who work in numbers and threats to gather paper that sounds like law. It's the law's odd rhythm. It moves in stiffness, and then sometimes with strange mercy. On the second night, the phone rang. It was Jim Carter. The voice that came through was small and spun with the kind of shame that makes men sound younger than they are. He came to my porch, and when I saw him I felt an old, complicated nostalgia. This was a man who'd once been able to laugh with his shoulders. Now he stood with the weight of something else. He wanted to apologize, and he wanted forgiveness in the same breath, as if the two were equal currencies. You don't have to say anything to me, I told him, because sometimes the only thing you can give another is the space to be human and not a thing. He hung his head, and I could see in his hands the tremor of someone who'd been given too many chances for good sense. You tell Emily I'm sorry, he said. I tried to fix it and it got worse. I thought I could trade one trouble for another. The words came like a confession finally admitted to a priest. I'm sorry. She wasn't ready to see him yet, and for reasons I won't pretend are noble, I didn't make them sit in the same room. Forgiveness is a thing that must be chosen. It isn't mine to grant. But his apology was a thing that, when you listen to it, does unclench a part of you. He left before the sun was fully gone. The county judge called for an emergency hearing the next morning. Tom had pushed, and the clerk had found a slot. We sat in a narrow room that smelled of well-used leather and the faint dust of centuries of petitions. Judge Halloran was a woman with a voice like a bell. She heard our case with the kind of attention that makes you feel, for a moment, as if the world might come to a decision on decency. Victor Salazar showed up at the hearing, of course, with his own papers and language of secured interest. His lawyer used words like consent and statute of commerce, and he spoke about title and the rights that paperwork supposedly guarantees. But when Tom called the bank representative to testify, and they produced the email that showed the loan had been paid and forgiven years before, well, the room shifted. It leaned with us when the ledger told the truth. The judge didn't give anything tragic. She gave the kind of legal breathing room a person needs. She granted a temporary injunction against Salazar Recovery Services, stopping any immediate enforcement on the lien, while the court could investigate the authenticity of the signatures and the chain of custody for the documents. She ordered a referral to the district attorney if fraud was suspected. Her hands moved like a surgeon's, precise, not showy. That day, for the first time since she arrived, Emily let herself exhale in the courthouse lobby like a person given permission to be human for a few minutes more. We walked back to the truck in a rain that started soft and then turned steady, as if the sky had decided the world needed washing. Emily's hair had come loose from the braid and plastered her neck. The rain made her look younger, like a page turned back to a less complicated decade. She kept her hands in her pockets and said nothing for a long while. "Do you have to go?" Danny asked her, the boy from the porch who had followed us into town with a single-mindedness that I admired. He looked at her with the fierce curiosity of a kid who is learning to understand the complexities grown people try to hide under simple sentences. When he said it, I felt something convulse in my chest, a tenderness and an anger and an old grief all wrapped together. She looked at him, and there was that freeze for a second. The one that started all of this, but it was different now. Her shoulders unbunched and her eyes found mine. "No," she said. "No, I think I'm not going anywhere." The words were small, but they were chosen. They were the first thing in months or maybe years she'd said that wasn't tied to a debt or a bargain. She said them like a person who'd practiced a truth until it fit. We had the injunction, but that only slowed them down. It didn't make the problem go away. It meant they might have to prove in court what they'd filed. It meant a fight, upstairs in rooms where men in suits hide behind statutes. And it meant Victor Salazar would be back, because men bent on extracting value find legal obstacles like currents that they think they can navigate. When we got home, Rex met us at the gate like it was a sacred border. He bumped his head against our calves and made sure wondering was spelled out around our feet. Emily went to the shed and took down an old pair of work gloves, as if to learn how to hold things again. She came back and asked me, quiet and precise, "What now?" "What now?" I echoed because it was the million-dollar question. We do the work. We wait for Tom to file the follow-up. We keep the sheriff on our side. We make sure your name is not in a ledger where thieves keep accounts. She nodded. The rain stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving a wetness that made the air smell sharp and clean. The sky went the color of old slate. Out in the field, some cattle lowed, their voices small and certain. There are moments in a life when you step into a role because no one else will. I thought of my father again, of his rule that you don't let a person be treated like a thing. I thought of the mornings when breakfast was the only plan we had, and how that, in the end, was a way of keeping something decent in our bellies. I set the kettle on, poured coffee into chipped mugs, and we sat on the porch while the sun tried to find a way through the cloud. She started to come out of her shell in small ways. She learned to feed Rex in the mornings, hands clumsy at first with the bag of food, then precise as if repetition knit her into belonging like thread through a cloth. She stayed when the county inspector came by and watched the way she answered questions like a person assembling trust, one plank at a time. She mended a fence post when I asked and laughed at her own missteps. Those are the tiny currencies by which people rebuild a place for themselves. But Victor's shadow lengthened. He kept to polite calls, friendly with the kind of cordiality built to wear people down. Once, he sent a letter that had the air of a gentleman, but with a sentence that lodged under your skin. "We will enforce our rights unless you choose settlement." The phrasing was a kind of polite pressure that men like him excel at. Soft hands with iron wrists. I should have known the day they first came through my gate that this was not going to be solved by a few signatures and a judge's pen. People who hunt value don't often stop with a legal hold. They circle, they threaten, they test. But we had a thing they didn't expect. Grit wrapped in quiet, a lawyer willing to move fast, and a sheriff who remembered that people are people, and paperwork is only a thin thing between decency and being taken. 3 days, Tom had said. It felt like the length of a breath stretched across a canyon. We used the time to gather witnesses, to pull bank records, to compare signatures. Emily talked to the DA's office because there were fingerprints left in fraud that someone who knows what to look for could read. I watched her learn to speak, like a woman who owns a sentence. She stopped apologizing for taking up space. Then, the day before the hearing I'd hoped would settle enough of this to let us sleep easy. A truck rolled down my lane at dusk. It was not the car with silver suits. It was a rusted pickup with a trailer hitched, bearing the mark of Salazar's subcontractors. Men who do the messier work when the polished faces need distance. They parked like they owned the line of dirt, the trailer like a dark promise. I walked to the gate with the kind of slow, deliberate steps a man takes when he wants to be ready for trouble without making it his guest. Rex walked at my side, a black blur of focused and patient fury. They came up my driveway like they were testing whether I knew how to keep a property line. One of them had a clipboard, as if he'd been practicing the part of official. "You can't be here," I said as they climbed the steps. "We have business with Ms. Carter," the man said. He spoke like someone reciting the words men with badges had taught him. "We're just here to confirm identity." "Confirm it from the distance of the public right-of-way," I told him. "You step onto my land without a court order, and I'll make sure the sheriff knows you made a move." They looked at each other like waiting for permission to be mean as a task, and we were the slow ones. The man with the clipboard smiled like he was certain the day would trend in his favor. The trailer door creaked as if it were a throat preparing to speak. We stood there, a man and a few hired hands and a dog, and the wind moved the field like it was watching. Emily came to the porch, gloves on, hands ready to do the chores that had been refused to her by others. When she saw the men, something in her face hardened. Not in the ugly way, but in a way that belongs to people who have had enough and are learning to hold to their own edges. "You're not taking me anywhere," she told them. There was no bravado in it, only a simple statement of possession, the possession of choice. The man with the clipboard smirked. "We're acting on the documentation," he said. "You signed." "I never consented," she said. "I didn't sign it, my father did, or someone signed for him. I don't owe anyone my life." They argued as men who sit behind counters argue, loud with the conviction of being within their rights, soft with the menace of practice. I called the sheriff. I called Tom. Victor Salazar's men put their hands on their hips like they were ready to walk away, and then as if some order came to them through their earpieces, they backed down a step. "We'll be in touch," the man said. "We'll wait for the paperwork." They left with the sort of threat that sounds like a calendar being turned. That night after they drove off, after the yard quieted and the sky filled with the small bitter stars of the country, Emily came and sat beside me on the porch. She put her hands on her knees and looked out at the field like it was an equation she was trying to solve. "I keep thinking," she said, "if it hadn't been for us meeting, it might have been worse." "What do you mean?" I asked. "If you hadn't opened the gate," she said, "I probably would have gone back to believe I had a price. I would have left because they told me to. I would have thought there was nothing else." I thought about the way the boy had asked her if she was leaving, and how the freeze in her body had been the first honest measure of fear. The boy didn't know the depth of things. He only asked the question because it was small and simple. The question had been a hinge. On some days the hinge opens, and on some days it holds the door shut. We had, by stubbornness and a little bit of law, and a great deal of doggedness, kept that hinge from being used as a handle to drag her away. We didn't know what the next day would bring. There were papers to be filed, witnesses to be heard, signatures to be examined under the microscope of people who know how to read forgery. There were men who would try the slow method of pressure, the kind made of polite letters and calendar reminders. And more than that, there were the small, insistent things, the letters that arrived with the smell of a firm hand, the phone calls that tried to sound casual, the men who parked too close to the mailbox and waited as if waiting were a kind of work. We had to make the paper speak louder than their muscle. We had to make the law move with a speed that didn't usually favor people who wore grease under their fingernails and had a dog that shed like confetti. Tom drew up the motion like a man building a bridge that might have to carry a crowd of angry paper. He wanted affidavits, copies, witnesses who could stand and say what they'd seen without sounding like folk at a kitchen table telling a story. We found a handwriting analyst in the city, an older woman with steady fingers and a reputation for not being impressed by what polished lawyers brought into her office. She smelled faintly of tea and old books and looked at the subpoena like it was another thing she'd set straight. "You know fraud when you see a thumbs down of the hand," she told us, not unkind. She ran magnified images, compared loops and pressure, the way a person pulls their pen across a line when their hand is shaking from guilt, or from the weather. She wrote a report that said the signature on the Salazar filing was inconsistent with other samples from Jim Carter, and inconsistent with Emily's known hand. The words "forgery probable" sat like a small bomb on top of our packet. Tom bundled the papers into a neat stack the morning we took them to the clerk. You could feel the air in town change when you carried evidence like that. People's shoulders shifted, like a field remembering how to stand after a storm. Sheriff Mason walked with me into the hearing room and sat in the back, a quiet anchor. He had that look about him like he'd rather be doing anything else, but he also had my number in his phone and could read when I slept badly. The courtroom was low-ceilinged and smelled of coffee and old ink. People shuffled in with the deliberate quiet of animals that sense weather. Victor Salazar came in with the same smoothness he always wore, suit pressed, shoes uncomplaining. He greeted no one. He knew the parts of this place, he'd had practice in them. His lawyer carried a briefcase like a shield and a smile that suggested he carried no shame. Jim Carter sat in the gallery like someone who'd been told aloud that they were not wanted at the table. He'd come gray and thin, his hat clutched in his hands. The first time I saw him that day, his shoulders made a small, apologetic rounding. He looked older than his years, not only because of the drink but because grief folds a man inward until you see the edges of him. Tom began with a simple presentation. He laid out the bank email that showed the loan was paid in full and forgiven years before. He placed the county records on the judge's bench and showed the recent lien filed under Emily's name. Then he asked the handwriting analyst to explain what she'd seen. She spoke soft and clear, like someone reading instructions you didn't think you needed. She described the pen pressure, the hesitant strokes, the way the signatory attempted to replicate someone else's flourish and missed the rhythm. She didn't use words meant to inflame. She used words that ordered things into different rooms. Comparison, discrepancy, probability. When she said probable forgery, the courtroom didn't explode. It rearranged. Victor's lawyer tried to counter with chain of title arguments and the usual thrum about secured interests. He read passages from statutes and made the motion that the filing looked, on its face, to be in order. But when Tom called the bank representative, the woman from earlier who had the bank's email open in the record, she testified to the timing. The date the loan was forgiven, the account numbers matched, the way a federal disaster relief check had paid down the principal at the right time. Her voice was flat, but the facts were heavy. The turn came when Tom, in cross, asked for every document Salazar claimed to present as the basis for its lien. There was a pause in the proceedings then, a small valley where expectation sat and held its breath. Victor's counsel handed over a file with neat staples and glossy paper that tried to look like a chain of assignment. But the handwriting analyst had a separate, earlier sample from Jim Carter, a tax form, a signature on a farm supply receipt that an investigator had found in a drawer. Under a microscope, the difference showed like two different dialects of the same language. When the DA's representative leaned forward, you could feel the shift. This might be more than a civil squabble. Fraud, criminal fraud, moves in a different gear. It turns documents into evidence and people into witnesses who might be asked to tell the truth under oath. The deputy from the DA's office asked questions about whether any of the parties had been coerced, whether any payment had been delivered for the lien. There, a hole opened. Salazar's men had no receipt for any payment to Jim Carter, no notarized chain proving consent. The veneer thinned. Jim Carter's testimony came later, and I could smell the fight in his throat when he stood. Tom warned me beforehand. Sometimes a man like Jim will stand and take the lesser shame to keep from the worst. Sometimes he'll lie. Sometimes he'll finally say what he's avoided. He chose the last. He told the court, in a voice thin with the remnants of the bar and better-sounding pretenses, that he had signed a document on behalf of himself, and that he'd thought, in a dizzy way, that he was making a deal to hold the house together. He said he had not told Emily. He said he'd been desperate and wrong and that the signature on one of the documents wasn't hers. He told them he'd been the one to present the papers, trying to buy time with promises he knew he couldn't keep. His hands shook when he admitted it. He spoke of the cards and the nights when the house had emptied the final cup from its shelf, and the bills had gathered under the bed like dust. "You signed for her?" Tom asked, looking neither cruel nor accommodating, only direct. "Maybe," Jim said. "Maybe I did. Maybe I tried to make it look like she had a say. I don't know the law enough to say it right. I waited because I thought if I made it look official they'd be gentle. Give me a month, a year. I thought I could pay it back." He swallowed. "I was wrong." That admission is not a cinematic confession, so much as a man stepping out of his own loop of lies. It was enough to make the DA take notice. It was enough to make the judge ask a question about whether the forgery was an individual act or part of a pattern designed to mislead. The DA's rep made notes. Victor sat like a carved man, his jaw not moving but his eyes taking in each thing with a scale, as if weighing profit against risk. He had the look of a predator who has met a door barred unexpectedly and is calculating whether he can wait the person out. When the judge finally gave her ruling, she did not shout or make grand pronouncements. She read the room the way someone reads a weather pattern, quietly, with attention, and a kind of weary mercy. She granted a permanent order voiding the lien on the property filed under Emily's name, and ordered the county recorder to expunge the record of that filing pending further investigation. She ordered Salazar Recovery Services to cease any actions related to that lien, and to provide full documentation of how the filing came to be. Importantly, she referred the matter to the district attorney for criminal investigation into potential forgery and fraud. She also issued a warning to parties who had filed documents without verifying signatures. The court did not look with favor upon such things. Victor's lawyer protested in the low language of men who hope that legal inconvenience will sift into practical profit, but the judge's gavel brought a finality that felt, for once, like a straight jaw. Her ruling did not promise that Victor would be disbarred from doing business, or that Jim Carter would not face charges. It promised instead that the paper could no longer be used to pry Emily from her life. That was enough for the moment. Outside the courthouse, it was raining steady, like someone had finally decided to wash the dust off the county. Emily held her coat close and laughed at nothing, a small, incredulous sound like someone who has discovered an unlocked door behind a wall. The DA's investigator, plain-spoken, gray-eyed, spoke to her about cooperating, about whether she wanted to press for charges or to let the process unfold without her involvement. She listened, then decided to give a statement. She wanted to press the matter because she felt a responsibility to make sure other people didn't become the currency for someone else's debt. Jim walked up to us after the hearing. There was a weight in his steps, like a man rearranging the way he stood in the world. He looked at Emily and said, "I'm sorry." It was an old, small apology, but it was something. Emily didn't forgive him out loud. She didn't have to. Forgiveness is a bridge built slowly over a river you can't see yet. She told him quietly that she wanted him to go to counseling and that she would join a hearing if she needed to. It wasn't reconciliation, at least not that day, but it was a start. He left with the sort of humility that is not heroic but is at least honest. Victor left too, but his last look at us had the polite cruelty of someone who thinks the world owes him continuity. He wasn't beaten. Legal setbacks are often like thorns that bruise before they teach. He would pivot, find new avenues, send new letters. That's the way predators work. If you close one door, they look for an unlocked window. But that day he left without the house. That was a victory we could count in the small currency of breath. Back at the ranch, the work started again like a liturgy. There's a rhythm to chores. Feed the dog, check water, mend a fence. Those tasks make people into the sort of creatures who remember what their hands can do. Emily did the mornings and watched the way the coffee pot sang. She learned to loosen the hinge on the chicken coop, to feed the calves, to stack the hay square, and even particular. She carried herself differently. Not because she'd been granted assurance by a judge alone, but because she'd watched herself speak truth and the world not swallow her for it. We found a rhythm of small gestures between us. She would come to the porch with the chipped mug in the morning and hand it to me as if it were a coin of trust. I would look up from whatever needed doing and see how the light caught her hair. We sat in silence sometimes because the silence at the ranch is part of how a person talks when the rest of the world has too much noise. One afternoon, after a day of rain had left the air scrubbed and the dirt still glinting with water, she put her hand on my knee while we sat on the back steps watching Rex chase his shadow. It was the kind of contact that made you know the other person was choosing you in a small, steady way. Months braided themselves into something that looked less like a wound and more like an arrangement of stitches. Emily went to court when the DA wanted to follow the forgery, and she gave truthful testimony. The DA moved at their own slow, deliberate pace. Charges filed, interviews conducted, the sort of machinery the law uses to turn a mess into accountability. Victor's company received a few subpoenas. The investigator asked questions that had the polite edge of a man wanting to see a pattern. I won't pretend the legal process is clean or fast. It is a thing of paper and people and patience. But it was moving in a direction that put the burden where it belonged. People in town began to look at Emily differently. Not everyone, and not all at once, but in the way of small towns where reputations are reforged in the public square. A neighbor borrowed her tool and told another neighbor in the feed store how she helped fix a fence. A woman from church asked if she'd like to join the quilting group. Small things that are the exact opposite of being collateral. They are ornaments of belonging. She started to answer less often when people offered pity, and more often when they offered work. And us, Jack and Emily, two people with old scars, found that our closeness was not a sudden conflagration, but a necessity. We talked about small things. We talked about cars and cattle and the weather. We sometimes spoke about the dead. I told her about the night my wife had gone, how the kitchen had been full of things that knew her hands. She listened the way people listen when they are slowly learning someone's edges. In time, she told me about the nights she waited in motels with the envelope, how she had believed in bargains because some people taught her the world was transactional. Her voice would tighten when she told it. She hated the memory of being measured like an account. One evening, months after the court, we sat by the barn while Rex paced the fence line. A wind came that smelled of juniper and rain-off dust. Danny Hale, who has a skill for arriving when curiosity outpaces common sense, ran up the drive with his bicycle and asked the question again because children do what adults fear, to ask plainly. "Are you leaving?" he said, the same small, unadorned line like he'd learned it from a porch swing poet. I remember how we both held ourselves, like a single animal listening for a sound it used to fear. Emily's hand went to the envelope on the table by habit, a small reflex left over from the early days when that paper had felt like an explanation she owed the world. She looked at Danny and then at me. For a moment something tightened at the base of her throat, the old freeze, but it didn't root her anymore. She'd practiced saying no without shame. She'd practiced saying yes without needing the world's permission. "No," she said, and the voice came like a bell. "I'm not leaving." The phrase had weight. It was not a defense. It was a decision. She turned the look toward me, and there was an answering in my stomach like something waking. We had come a long way from a porch where a hand had stopped mid-reach. The gate bell still rang when people came, and sometimes it rang for trucks with mundane needs. But now when the bell sounded and someone, neighbor, kid, curious stranger, asked the same question, the answer on our porch was a practiced thing. A person choosing to stay because they wanted to, not because a ledger said they must. There were days of tenderness that felt like town prayers. We mended things side by side. We planted a small bed of vegetables by the shed. She learned to dig without apologizing for taking space. She put notes in the feed room where she'd written the name of a chore and placed a small, crooked heart in the corner of it, an emblem of someone who was learning the grammar of belonging. I told her about my late wife in pieces, short, honest things. She told me about what it had been to think she had a price. We touched on loss like people compare weather. You tell what it's done, you trade forecasts. There was one night I remember because it asked the most of both of us. The sky was a hard, uncluttered black, and the wind had come up like a thing with teeth. A pair of trucks rolled down the lane, clean, like they'd been waxed for shows, and parked this time at a respectful distance. Victor's men had learned to be polite in movements, to send letters that sounded friendly. This time they came in with a letter from their council suggesting mediation, as if the way to profit is by the appearance of peace. I walked with them to my back fence, Rex at my side like a small sentinel. They spoke in the currency of deals. We can settle, we can withdraw if you make a number we can respect. I could see the calculation in their eyes. Profit is a language. I told them the house was not a commodity to be traded for the sake of comfort. I told them the law had spoken. The DA had a file. There were witnesses and handwriting analysts. They left with a polite nod, and that night we sat and listened to the field breathe and wondered about the measure of quiet. Sometimes the most radical thing you do is ordinary. Have coffee with someone at dawn. Hand them a mug chipped on the rim because you've been using it too. Look at their hands and see what they are capable of. One late afternoon, the two of us walked to the far pasture, and I showed her an old fence post I'd been meaning to replace. We worked beside each other, hammering in nails in silence, feeling the weight of shared labor. She laughed when she missed a strike and the nail bent. She didn't apologize. She had begun to know how to be present. Weeks turned into months, and people forgot the particularity of how fear had made her still. The record in the county books had been corrected. The forged paperwork entered into evidence, and the DA had moved on to other business while still keeping a file open. Victor had been ordered to submit records. His company drew the displeasure of a judge in a later filing, and took a hit to its reputation in a small way. Not a criminal punishment yet, but a bruise in a ledger where men like to keep replacements for ethics. I don't say we beat him. Predators adapt. But we put up signs that said we were not easy quarry. Emily's father did what he could with the shame he carried. He showed in small ways that he wanted to change. He mowed the yard on the rare mornings he could stay sober. He brought a pie to the porch that he said he'd made without much pride but a good deal of effort. The world doesn't grant absolution for a surrender. It provides instead a day-by-day ledger where you make better choices and hope they count. I watched Emily choose the measure of her heart when she invited him to help fix a fence. He came, saying little, and for a few hours their hands were quiet apprenticings. The ranch settled into a new equilibrium that was not unscarred, but was less raw. We kept the envelope for a while, not as evidence but as a reminder, placed in a shoebox with the handwriting analyst's report and a photograph of the farmhouse. It sat under the loose floorboard in my bedroom, a hidden thing that we both could touch if we needed to recall how fragile a life can be, and how firm a person can become when they refuse to be bargained over. There were tender things that grew like small flowers, a hand brushing hair from a brow, a quiet comment across the table about a bird's nest, Emily's laughter catching like a bell. Once, on a cold morning, she kissed me on the cheek to thank me for a cup of coffee. It was a slow, gentle kind of affection that felt less like a promise and more like a rest. We never rushed the speech that says you will be with someone. Instead, we kept choosing each day in small acts. One afternoon, a year after she first came to my gate, we had a county picnic down by the old schoolhouse. People came with potato salad and dogs on leashes and stories that stretched like quilts. Danny Hale raced up to us, now taller and cotter-pinned with the kind of awkwardness boys grow into. He looked at us and asked, with the same directness he'd always had, "So, are you leaving?" She grinned at him like someone who has discovered a private joke. Her eyes found mine, and we both might have felt the same small astonishment that the world keeps offering chances to redeem a question. "No," she said, and this time she added with a kind of mischief, "unless it's for pie." Danny beamed because that was the most reasonable conditional any child had ever heard. That night, after the picnic and the dish pile-up and the field with its long blue silhouette, we sat on the porch steps with Rex between us and watched stars come one by one. The gate bell lay quiet. The world had recalibrated. I thought about the man I had been the night she arrived, guarded, still wearing the memory of a different life, and the man I'd become, someone who would stand in front of a question to keep another from shrinking. I thought about her, the one who had first gone still at the sound of a boy's voice, and how she'd learned to move again on her own terms. You learn over time that justice is not a single verdict, but a seam that shows when people are held accountable and when communities refuse to accept the idea that human beings can be counted as collateral. You learn the world is made, not of spectacular moments, but of the dozen ways a person shows up for another. A kind word, a call to a lawyer, a night on a couch, a signature on a subpoena. For us, the most important thing was that the freeze had been answered not by someone else making the choice for her, but by her choosing. There are nights when I still wake in the dark and think of the envelope, and there are nights she wakes from dreams where hands counted her like money. We talk about those nights in the way people talk about storms after they pass, measurements and plans and new gutters. She teaches me to be present in softer ways, and I teach her, clumsily sometimes, some of the old rhythms of ranch life. We take turns tending the herd. We sometimes sit in silence and let the world move around us. It's not a neat story. Nothing involving people is. There are moments when we still have to lock doors and keep an eye out for letters that thinly veil intentions. There are times when the past sneaks in like a draft and makes the hair on your neck stand. But the ledger changed. The law, slow as it is, moved. The people she feared were held to account enough that she could plant the small garden behind the shed without feeling she was stealing ground. She learned to answer the world in ways she chose. I learned that protecting someone can turn into a partnership, And that save is a two-way thing. She saved me from the small loneliness I had accepted as fact. On the porch, where the gate bell has a sound like a punctuation mark, we keep a stack of chipped mugs and a box of nails. Rex buries his head in the crook of her knee, and we plan the fence lines like people who have decided to make a future that won't be traded. Danny sometimes brings his baseball glove and takes it upon himself to check the gate. He knows the lines of our yard and the way people ought to step in and out of other people's lives, with courtesy, and a question that's simple and honest. The boy asked me if I was leaving. He asked it of her first because children have a compulsion to ask the questions adults soften, and she froze. In that freeze was a life she'd been taught to own like debt. But the story didn't stop there. We made room for paperwork, for forensics, for a judge who would call a thing by its name. We made room for a battered man to say he was sorry, and for a daughter to decide how she would live. We made room for tenderness and for ordinary work. When she unfroze, it wasn't because someone else removed her price tag. It was because she had all the pieces she needed to choose. If this little story has landed with you, and you found something in it, about stubbornness, or law, or the way a hand on your knee can be the same thing as a lawyer's brief, share it with someone who likes quiet reckonings and messy, tender hope. Let me know in the comments which part you want to see next. The ranch in a long winter, a courthouse revisit, or maybe how Danny grows into a man who asks brave questions. Whatever comes, the gate will still be there, the bell will still ring, and someone will ask a hard, small question.